Serious. Nurses of Reddit, what are some of the most memorable deathbed confessions you've had a patient give? Viewer discretion is advised. Please do like, share, and subscribe. Kind of a confession. My grandmother was from Spain. At some point in my life, I was like, why don't I know how to speak Spanish? So I asked my mom, as I've never heard her speak Spanish either. She said, my mom came to America and was one of the "we are in America now, so we speak English now" people. When we started pestering her to teach us Spanish, she claimed that she forgot how to speak it. We all kind of thought she was full of shit, but she was adamant about it. She was sharp as a tack until her mid-90s and lived alone. Finally, it was too much, and we moved her to our house and then to assisted living because she wanted to be closer to her friends. When she ended up in a nursing home because she was on her last legs and her mind started to go, we caught her speaking Spanish to the mostly Hispanic staff. Basically, she had to go senile to forget that she told us that she couldn't speak Spanish. It was an unintentional confession, that she always knew how to speak Spanish, but she just didn't want to because it wasn't the American thing to do. I had a client, 90-year-old male, confess to his wife and children that while he was away on business, he obtained another family. He lived another 2 years. Oof. Took care of a World War II veteran with dementia. He would say the number 22 over and over, and the family never knew the significance of it. The numbers didn't line up with any significant events or dates that they were aware of. The day before he died, his mental state became incredibly clear, and he started telling the staff, 22 men. I killed 22 men over there. Poor guy. He lived with that anguish for 50 plus years. Had an elderly woman who had gone downhill and was on her deathbed for about a week. She kept asking me to read the Bible to her, and as soon as I would start, she would scream that he was coming to get her, that he was waiting right behind me. Very unnerving at 3 a.m. Finally, I asked her who was coming to get her, and she replied with, "The devil's coming for me because I let my husband rape our kids and did nothing." I was speaking with a nurse, and she said that a lot of patients pass away alone because they don't feel right passing over with other people present. That is why you have a lot of people waiting bedside, then go home and 10 minutes later, the person passes away. Apparently happens all the time. Old man who was the same ethnicity as my girlfriend. She did home care before becoming a nurse. When he was a boy in his home country, his eldest brother wasn't able to impregnate his wife because he was impotent after surviving an accidental electrocution. Wife demanded a child, so he got his younger brother to impregnate her. He was 13 at the time. Went on to get her pregnant with 2 more kids before moving to America. He was crying because none of his family back home really cared about him even though he was dying. They just wanted him to keep sending money. I recently cared for a woman who had multiple acute strokes in a short amount of time. A week before, she had been independent, riding her horse every day, still teaching part-time at the local school despite being in her 80s. By the time she got to me, she was completely nonverbal, incontinent, and unable to feed herself. I had a feeling that she was neurologically intact enough to understand what was going on, so I talked to her as much as I could when I was in the room. Talked to her about her daughters, who had called her every day, her husband, who hadn't called, but I left that part out, the weather, her horses, her students who had sent a card. On the last day of my work week, her daughter from out of state had finally found a flight up. They sat in silence and held hands for hours. Visiting hours ended right at shift change, so I walked in to give report as the daughter was saying goodbye. The patient then spoke what I knew were going to be her last words. "I'll always be looking after you," and pointed to her daughter and then at me, and then she fell asleep. 2 days later, when I came back to work, I was informed she had passed away in the night. Kind of similar, I suppose. I'm a scrub nurse. My job is to assist the surgeon during surgeries. I was preparing an elderly patient for a pretty high-risk surgery. There was a good chance he was going to be fine, but there was also a decent chance things were going to go south. He knew this. While the CRNA is doing her thing, getting the anesthesia ready, I'm standing next to him going over his chart and signed releases, and he says to me, "I need you to tell my wife I'm sorry for all the times I raised my voice at her. There weren't many times, but right now I wish there weren't any." That was the first time I ever got choked up at the bedside. Thank goodness for masks, because it helped hide my expression. I so badly wanted to tell him everything was going to be okay, but no one knew if it was going to be. I said back to him, "I'll do anything you need me to, but right now, let's think about some happy memories before you go under." I asked him to tell me about he and his wife's first date. Once he was under, I excused myself before scrubbing in to stop myself from crying. He made it through surgery, and his wife was waiting for him after being transferred from the PACU. Nurse here, an old lady gave me some questionable advice. She was this 90-something Italian nonna, all dressed in black skirts and dripping with rosary beads and crucifixes, very Catholic. She told me to be happy in life, you need 3 men. One for the money, one for the love, and one for the boom boom boom, sex. Can't say I agree with her, but it's certainly memorable. My dad loves small-town auctions, and over the years he collected all those boxes of stuff that would go for the lowest bid. He amassed quite a collection, filling the garage and a workshop out back. He always promised Mom he'd sell it all someday in some big garage sale or auction of his own. Then, one day, my mom's cancer returned, and the doctors told us this time it wasn't a fair fight. 2 weeks before she passed, I was sitting with her in the hospital. We'd run out of things to say. She looked up at the ceiling, trying to ignore the pain, and said, "Thank God, at least I won't have to deal with your dad's stuff." Me and my mom burst out laughing. Don't tell my dad. There was a gentleman on his deathbed at 56 years old. He was pissed off, yelling that he started at an early age going to preschool to get into the right grade school, to get into the right high school, to get into the right Ivy League university and high-paying job. That was the year he was to set up his family for life, being able to fund their college and pay off the mortgage. This went on for about 4 hours before he passed. Truly tragic. This was a couple years back when I was doing a night shift rotation. Maybe not quite the confession you were thinking, but it still breaks my heart to this day. Had a patient one night, perfectly fine, came back the next night and found out they had had a massive stroke mid-morning. Family had decided against surgery due to age factors and other things. Wife was telling me they had a good life together, about 40 to 50 years of being married, kept vigil at the bedside all night holding their hand. All the kids and grandkids were there too. I told them, although patient was unconscious, they could still hear, so encouraged the family to keep talking to them, tell them everything they want to say before it's too late. Around 4 a.m., I could tell the patient was close to the end, their breathing changes, and the wife asked me if it was time. I gave her an honest answer, and she became hysterical, clutching the patient's hand. She kept crying that she wasn't ready to say goodbye. She had so many other plans for them to live out, that she didn't want them to die. She wanted them to continue living. She wished she hadn't withdrawn treatment so they could have more time together. Patient passed away 15 minutes later. It's been years, but that still stands out to me as one of the most heartbreaking deathbed moments. And the narrator's crying. One of the most challenging moments I had with a patient that was passing was a woman in her 80s with advanced dementia and trying to recover from a severe bed sore that had gone septic from a nursing home with a bad reputation. She often confused me with her second husband. Her daughter told me I looked a lot like him. The patient would often talk about our sexual exploits, including swinging and partner swapping, as well as a very wild adventures. I had given up on trying to tell her I was not her husband because I just confused her and upset her, so I learned to just play along. She talked to me often about our children and other family and many non-sexual adventures they had. It made her happy to talk about it and often left me with a smile. I'm an intern and I work with the elderly at a day center. A 90-something-year-old man who was very loved by everyone was committing euthanasia, which is legal in the Netherlands that afternoon. He still wanted to come to us. All the nurses and social workers were pretty emotional for his last day. It can be weird to talk to someone in the morning, knowing they will end their lives that afternoon. I got to go on a walk with him. I was pushing his wheelchair, and we just talked about life. That 1 hour, he taught me so much about life. He told all about his trauma from World War II, about how it affected him, and about how he overcame it. He never told anyone, not even his wife, about everything that happened. He gave me so many life lessons that day, and I will be always thankful for that. I'm an RN, male and white, and worked with many elderly. I had one 90-plus-year-old male talk about how he had been a part of the KKK in his youth and how ashamed he was of taking part in several lynchings and other assaults on blacks and even some white Catholics. He'd had several CNAs and patient care techs that were either black or Hispanic, and he always was so polite and sometimes even loving towards them. I could tell how deeply his past haunted him. He asked me not to share this information with any of the staff. The last days before he became too weak to speak anymore, he asked one of the black RNs I worked with if she forgave him. She did not know what he was asking forgiveness for, but told him she did, and helped him get right with Jesus. He passed peacefully a couple days later. I also had a woman who was 100 plus tell me she had been really badly abused by her first husband, but was stuck in the marriage because of the culture at the time. He'd been thrown from a horse that he'd also been very cruel to and kicked several times. She ignored his cries for help and let him die. She said she had never told anyone about it, but she felt guilty for it for over 80 years and could still hear him screaming for help. We talked about it a long time. I was working night shift, and it gave me a chance to spend extra time with some patients. My experience working with people with PTSD helped me to help her to see that she was acting to protect herself and others from him and responding from a place of natural fear. Before she passed, she told me I had helped her find peace with it. My faith and my own life experience has taught me that people do things in the moment because it is often what they believe they have to do, and not to judge them, but to help them find peace within themselves. My first year as a nurse, I worked in palliative care, had a 28-year-old dying of cancer. She moved here from Canada to be with her boyfriend, who left her a year after moving. We weren't expecting her to deteriorate so fast. I held her hand as she died alone without her family or friends, but right before she died, she told me she wished she never left Canada and cried. Her family were overseas and couldn't make it in time. It's memorable to me because it reminds me to tell my family I love them regularly and to spend time with friends and to stop making excuses. My wife had 6 older brothers. She was the last offspring of an extremely abusive father, and as a girl was always outcast even by her brothers, who were sons of a different mother than hers. She severed ties with the father right before we met each other and had been trying to get her mom out of that abusive relationship. The brothers were trying to be a family together and even started inviting her to meetings and stuff, but the scars were too deep, quite literally. The father was depressed in his 60s and tried suicide twice. Both times, my wife was the only relative that went to the hospital, pretty much because she was the only one whose number he knew. It fucking destroyed her for weeks after. Then, one day the father had a heart attack. He survived, but was in pretty bad shape alone in a hospital bed. My wife called the brothers, and the 7 of them decided that he would reap what he sowed and refused to go to the hospital. She was in therapy for months before, and I've never seen her with such a strong resolve. He died a couple days later. She asked for me to deal with the body. A clerk in the hospital told me that day that the whole staff was talking about the man that was crying hours before a second deadly heart attack and desperately asking, "Why did none of my kids show up? Where are my sons and daughter?" I spent like 30 hours freaking out about if I should tell my wife about that. I decided to tell. She made a face that was like iron, held my hand and said, "Finally some closure," and proceeded to call each brother and tell them. I tell you not, the woman went through serious shit in her life, and Nels dream about being as tough as she is. My dad passed away from COVID a few months back. In the week or so we spent at the hospital with him, we had grown quite close to the staff and the respiratory therapists. After he had passed, most came in to mourn with us and offer condolences. The RT said something I will never forget. "We all get our turn in that bed. The best we can hope for is to be surrounded by loved ones." It was wildly impactful and a great way to deal with his passing for me. I know it's not the same, but hopefully it helps others who are reading about deathbeds. Doctor here. Working in the deep south, I've heard a lot of patients regret disowning their gay, lesbian children and the relationship they could have had. Unfortunately, rigid religious political dogma tears apart more families than most people realize. Life is short. Accept people, especially the ones you love, for who they are and not who you would like them to be. That's always been the takeaway lesson I got from hearing those stories. I walked into my mom's room, and she was just sitting in her chair with her head tilted and looking off into the distance. After a minute, she looked at me and smiled and said, "Well, that's it then. There's nothing more to do." She wasn't really lucid at the time, so I just carried on with our visit. And when they brought her supper, I told her good night. A few hours later, the nurse called me that she had suddenly taken a turn for the worse. I held her hand while she passed, but she never said anything more.